Well, hello, this is Jeff Short, and you are here for another edition of Christian Answers, where we tackle tough questions from a Christian perspective, from a biblical Christian perspective. And today I'm going to be starting a series on a book review of Richard Dawkins' book, The Greatest Show on Earth. And this book is The Evidence for Evolution. And as Christians, we look at the Bible, we look at the first few chapters of Genesis. We trust the Bible, we understand the Bible is God's Word, we accept the idea of revelation. We're not the only people that accept the concept of revelation. There are different religions in the world that do accept the concept that God has revealed His will to people. But as Christians, we embrace the idea of revelation. We believe that God has revealed Himself, and we therefore trust His revelation contained in the Bible. Now, how do we know the Bible is true? That's another topic. I want to get into that at another time. But let's say that I have dealt with that whole subject of how we know that the Bible is true, how we know that God has revealed Himself in His Word, the Bible. And let's assume, for the sake of argumentation, that the first three chapters of Genesis are true, as Christians believe. We believe that the first three chapters of Genesis are true, just as we believe that every chapter in the Bible is true. And therefore, we have to fit all of reality in with God's revelation. We prioritize His revelation. We don't just see everything there as just some kind of a symbol or metaphor or poetic description of reality. We look to the Bible, and if it is describing something in a straightforward manner, we take it straightforwardly. If Jesus is speaking a parable, then we understand it as a parable. And if someone is telling a story in the Bible as an illustration for a teaching point, then we take it as a story. But if it is historically framed, if something is explained in terms that can be applied literally, we understand it literally. That's what we do. That's what everyone does in any document that you sit down with. For example, if we examine the Constitution of the United States, for example, if someone came in and tried to say, well, you can't understand that First and Second Amendment literally, you have to take that symbolically or poetically, and then go on and weave some kind of strange tale from the first two amendments in our Constitution, we would look at them as crazy, and we should. Well, when we look at the Bible, we have to figure out, okay, what is before us? What is the context of what is being taught? And then whatever the context is, we want to understand what is being written within that context. Now, the first three chapters of Genesis seem to be, indicate to be, to straightforward narrative. And so we want to look at them. And they describe a situation where God creates men and women. He created Adam and Eve. The other animals, the other creatures on earth had been created, and then He comes to Adam and Eve, and He creates Adam and Eve. Now, if you believe in the theory of evolution and Darwin's theory, and if you accept the theory of evolution, then you have to somehow believe that God did not directly create Adam and Eve, but you have to believe that through a long drawn-out process, and also including the primates and some kind of primate was the relative of Adam and Eve, and somehow the human race started with Adam and Eve. You have to somehow fit it in. Well, that doesn't seem to fit. It seems to be that the Bible is, yes, it teaches that God directly created the historical personages of Adam and Eve. So we have to wonder, okay, is this macro theory of evolution that's being taught by Richard Dawkins and others, is that actually true? Because it seems to contradict what the Bible is teaching about how God created Adam and Eve. Not even talking about the other problems of different animals, the days of creation, and so forth. And we're not even dealing with the issue of, is that a literal day or a figurative day or whatnot. We're talking just about, I'm narrowing it to Adam and Eve. Were these two people created directly by God or not? And the Bible seems to indicate that they were directly created by God. The theory of evolution would have to say that they were not directly created by God. So what I want to do is I want to look at the theory of evolution as explained by Richard Dawkins. Now, why go to him? Why take his theory of evolution, and why center on that? Because he's one of the most popular teachers of evolution in the world today. And that's what he has as his, quote, life mission, is to spread the evolutionary theory near and far. In fact, he complains in the book here that only a certain percentage of people in the United States believe in evolution, and this is terrible, and we have to eliminate that small percentage that do believe in evolution, because these people are being brainwashed and blah, blah, blah. And so he is on a quest to get everyone in the whole world to believe in the theory of evolution and to not believe in any divine creation. He wants to rule that out immediately. So we're going to review this book, and we're going to look at the chapters and his main points and his main arguments for the theory of evolution. Now, he begins the book by saying that when he was reviewing his other books on evolution, and he's written a number of different books on evolution, and we don't have time to go over all of the books that he's written on evolution, such as The Selfish Gene, The Extended Phenotype, The Blind Watchmaker, River Out of Eden, Climbing Mount Improbable, and so on and so on. Now, the strange thing he says is that even though he has laid out and explained the theory of evolution, it occurred to him that he had never really set down the evidences for evolution. And when I read that, I thought, what? I thought, what were your other books trying to do? He was telling people that he was giving the evidence for evolution. He was dismissing all of the criticisms that people have made about his works, that he's essentially explaining the theory and presenting the theory as evidence for itself. He dismissed all that in the past, but now it seems like he's coming back to that criticism, and he's saying, well, you know what? I never really have laid out the evidence for the theory. I was basically just explaining the theory and why it's true and how it's true, but I never really got around to laying out the evidence for evolution. That's an odd statement to make after you have spent decades telling everyone that you believe in the evidence for evolution, and all your books explain the evidence of evolution, then coming back and saying, well, I didn't really lay out the evidence. That's what we have been saying for years. You have spent your time explaining the theory. And this is what I find a lot of times with people who are totally convinced of the theory of evolution. Whenever you talk to them, whenever you dialogue with them, and I have dialogued on a number of occasions in public debate with such individuals, they will begin to fill in the theory for you, as if you didn't understand the theory. If you just understood the theory, then it would all become clear. And I keep coming back. I've said this a number of times in public dialogues with evolutionists. I've come and said to them, after they've given a long presentation, I have said, well, that makes total sense in your presentation of the theory, and according to the theory, but we have not heard the evidence for evolution. And here we go. Richard Dawkins comes, after many decades of lecturing and teaching on evolution, he comes to the point and he says, well, I haven't laid out the evidence for evolution, evidently, so that's a big gap in my part. I have to fill that with this book. And so this book is called The Greatest Show on Earth, The Evidence for Evolution. And so we're going to review this book. We're going to look at the main parts. Now, one of the things that he does in his introduction, chapter 1 actually, is he starts in a very curious way. It's a very non-scholarly way. It's a very non-intellectual way. It's a very popular way if you want to reach the masses, if you want to try to convince the masses. And this is his goal, because he's alarmed, I said before, at these statistics that show a large portion of the United States, the population, still does not accept the full theory of evolution. That really bothers him. And in other countries, it's even higher than 50%. Even in his own mother country, Britain, it's still alarmingly high for him that people still do not believe in the full theory of evolution. So he's aiming at a popular crowd. But the first chapter in the book, he repeats the phrase, the fact of evolution, at least a half a dozen times, if not over a dozen times. The fact of evolution, the fact of evolution. Evolution is a fact. Evolution is a fact. Let me just give you an example. Page 5, he says at the top, evolution is a fact. Page 6, middle of the page, evolution is a fact. Then on page 8, lower than the middle, it says evolution is a fact. After that, page 8, evolution is a fact. Top of page 9, evolution is a fact. Page 10, evolution is a fact. And so he just keeps on drilling into our minds. He's trying to program our minds. He's trying to drum into our minds. Evolution is a fact. Evolution is a fact. Evolution is a fact. As if a hypnotist is trying to just hypnotize you. Evolution is a fact. Evolution is a fact. Now, my question is, if you're going to lay out the facts of evolution, and you're going to lay out the evidence of evolution, the theory of evolution, why do you need to try to hypnotize people, propagandize people, manipulate people, or drill into their heads in the first chapter that evolution is a fact? Why aren't your arguments going to convince them of that? If you're going to keep repeating like a mantra, evolution is a fact, it seems to indicate that you may not trust the arguments that you're going to give will be strong enough to convince people at the end of your presentation that evolution is a fact. And so you have to drill this into them beforehand and keep repeating it and keep repeating it, because you don't trust the weight of your evidence. Very unscholarly, and it's curious, Darwin himself doesn't do that. Darwin doesn't propagandize at the beginning of his book to try to drill something into someone's mind and then present what he has found. He trusts that people who look at the evidence, if they weigh the evidence, will come to that conclusion on their own. They don't need to be brainwashed into coming to that conclusion. So Richard Dawkins seems to betray a lack of confidence in his own evidence for evolution. And so that struck me as curious, as if he is going to try to program you into believing this, and then he's going to afterwards give you the evidence that you've been pre-programmed to believe anyway through his rhetoric. Curious, odd, strange. Well, we'll see if in fact his mantra is true. But we turn to the second chapter, and what he does there is he tries to talk about the persistent idea in the fixity of species and the idea of the substance of something that he blames on Plato. Plato presented the philosophy thousands and thousands of years ago, before the time of Christ even, that things had substances, ideal substances, and the actual thing was simply an expression of the ideal thing. For example, if you have a tree, there is somewhere an ideal tree, and then there is the tree, the actual tree, and it's not quite living up to the ideal tree, but it's you can see that it is related to the ideal tree. And he blames that on Plato, why we seem to feel that creatures in nature are things in themselves, and they have a classification, and that they never ever depart from that classification. He wants to try to explode that idea, because then he wants to say that evolution has shaped everything, that one creature can turn into, through process of time and natural selection, into any variety of creatures, that everything is related to everything else, because everything started with a creature, and everything has formed from that living thing. So he wants to try to explode the idea that things have fixed species or fixed forms. Now, curiously enough, the Bible actually talks about some kind of a fixity of creatures. In the early chapters of Genesis, it says that God made the land creatures after their kind, and it says God made the sea creatures after their kind, and so on and so forth. So these animals and these creatures and these living things in the book of Genesis are described as created by God after their kind. And people have always understood that to mean that these animals and living things described in Genesis are created by God, and they do not essentially depart from that specific form. So if God is creating the animals that went into the ark, for example, we have reference to in the book of Genesis a worldwide flood, and that there was some kind of ark or barge or great boat that was commissioned by God to be built by a man named Noah and his family, and they somehow were able to get the animals and creatures into that before the worldwide universal flood occurred. And that, as Christians, we also believe, because it's in the Bible. Of course, we believe it. And so if you take an animal that we suppose were found in the ark, for example, the dog, and you look at that dog, you would say that God created dogs, and we have a wide variety of dogs. Now, Richard Dawkins wants to say that if you look at the dog, for example, you will see that there are all kinds of varieties of dogs. And if you take your average run-of-the-mill mutt, which is a sort of a combination of all kinds of dogs, it's not any one breed, it's just a general dog, a mutt. And if you, through breeding, professional breeding, you can actually turn that mutt over time into a small Mexican Chihuahua that can fit in your hands, or you can breed that generic dog, that mutt, into a huge horse-like Great Dane. And all of these different dogs can be created from that single dog through, he says, as an example of evolution. He says that's human evolution, human engineered evolution. And if you look at evolution in the dog, for example, human breeders can make such wide sweeping changes as creating these little Mexican hairless Chihuahuas that you can hold in one hand, They're like sort of a rat, a little white rat, or you can get these near horse-like Great Danes, all from breeding dogs. And he says if that could happen just in a few generations, in the lifetime of man, then what can nature do on its own? But the problem with that kind of thinking is that the evolution, if you want to call it, of a dog is vastly different than the kind of evolution Richard Dawkins is talking about. He's talking about not just creating other dogs from the general generic dog. He's talking about creating all kinds of animals that are not dogs. He's talking about going outside of the species dog, the kind dog, the category dog. He's talking about evolving things unendingly. He's talking about a generic dog being elastic to the point where you could actually create not only land animals, but sea creatures from the generic dog. You could actually possibly create bird-like creatures from the generic dog if there were conditions on Earth that were adapted and the type of survival of the fittest, natural selection occurred. You could elastically expand life far beyond the dog, and he thinks that's totally possible. Well, that's the question. That's the question. So the illustration that he makes of a dog as an example of evolution is a trivial illustration. It simply describes microevolution, and nobody questions microevolution. Everybody who disbelieves evolution in the grand scale, the macroevolutionary theory, accepts microevolution. Yes, things adapt. You can create a wide variety of dogs. You can create from the generic dog, you can create a wide variety of dogs, but there are limits, and there are limits to what you can create, and that's the whole point. That's the fixity of kind. That's what we see in the book of Genesis, and that's what we see in the evidence, the hardcore scientific evidence of today. Right now, if you take a dog like a Mexican hairless Chihuahua and you say, well, I want to evolve that into something other than a dog. And so you try as hard as you can, but you are not going to get that Mexican hairless rat-like dog into anything other than dog. And that confirms what the book of Genesis talks about as God made them after their kind. And so, and if you take the largest kind of dog, the Great Dane, for example, the tallest kind of dog, the biggest dog, and I've seen these. I was walking along the streets in New York once. I saw a woman come at me with what looked like a horse. She was leading it like she was leading a horse, but it was a Great Dane. And that thing was as big as some horses, bigger than some ponies, in fact. Amazing how breeders can breed the dog to that height and that size, but in fact they cannot create anything different than a dog. And so they're simply reshuffling the gene pool. And even if, now he talks about, well, what happens is a mutation occurs, and that is the key to changing this into another kind of animal. The problem is that even if a mutation does occur, a lone mutation, it doesn't change that dog into anything other than a dog. It usually kills the animal. It usually kills or dwarfs the animal or detrimentally affects the animal. But that mutation and that mutation alone does not change it into another kind of an animal. And that's what we find today in science. That's the scientific evidence today as far as the limits of evolution. So if you're going to use the illustration of the dog and say, see, look what humans have engineered with only in the span of civilization with the dog, then imagine what nature can do over millions and millions of years. That doesn't apply because what we only see through human engineering of dogs is more dogs. So if there's something there that's supposed to explain the wide-scale, grand-scale theory of evolution, the analogy isn't holding because it's not creating another type of animal which the theory of evolution does say should be occurring. So if you're pointing to the dog, that's not hardcore evidence. So again, he is using real evidence, real science, to try to explain something that he can't explain scientifically, and that is the changing of an animal into another thing. That's some of the observations that I've made on some of his early chapters. Now we're going to talk more about some of the arguments that he gives for evolution, and we're going to look at them again and see why they are deficient. But we have to keep reiterating, evolutionists like Dawkins usually like to talk about the grand scale of evolution, and then when you ask them for evidence, they give you the small scale evolution as evidence for the grand scale of evolution. Simply adding up the small scale evolutionary evidence that we know from science today and adding them all up and saying, see, if you add it all up, that's grand scale evolution. That doesn't work because that's not proving the grand theory. The grand theory requires somewhere, someplace, and what would help is if Dawkins could show how in the laboratory scientists are able to take a dog and make it into another kind of an animal. Now that wouldn't exactly be the way nature would do it, but at least it would show in principle it could be done. That hasn't even been shown. So we're a long way from proving this theory, people, and so we have to continually tell people like Richard Dawkins, the evidence you're giving us doesn't prove your grand theory. It only proves a small theory of evolution, and that's not disputed anyway. So we're going to talk more about the real evidence for evolution, and we're going to talk about the real evidence that is being presented and how it doesn't prove the theory he's trying to make it prove. Evolution is not a fact. It lacks the scientific evidence. We're going to talk more about that in the weeks ahead, so stay tuned for another edition of Christian Answers. God bless.